sometimes a strategy adopted as well. And I don't want to deny that if we were to increase the possibility of exit, some states would go that direction, and that would be a very bad thing. But it's at least an empirical question, admittedly a complex one. If communities were allowed to exit, would more states engage in oppression, or would more engage in the kind of rational calculation that you've just described to say, we could try to crush these people, but then we might lose them altogether, and maybe we ought to be smarter. That's at least, I don't know the answer. I don't know how one tests that, but at least it's a question to raise. It's not true that states will always reach for oppression. And part of what drives my project, I would note, is even in today's world in which there is no right of exit, many states reach for that tool. So I'm not sure we'd be much worse off if we actually articulated a right of exit. We'd at least have the possibility of thinking about gaining that sort of bargaining power that comes with the real possibility of exit. But we should acknowledge, and this is something I say repeatedly in the book, the model I'm proposing leads to conflict and violence. The question, though, is, does it lead to less? Right? Because there is no world in which we are going to have no conflict and no violence. So if my model were in place, there would be places where I would be unwelcome because I would be seen as the instigator of terrible civil wars. But there'd be other places where those wars would have been avoided by a peaceful process. And so the thing we have to think about in terms of designing a future is, might a greater openness to changing borders actually lower the temperature on various conflicts, create options for resolution that are currently unavailable because now you have to fight it out in the borders you have and fix those problems. That's what I'm trying to look at in the book, is might we in fact not reach a perfect world, but a world with less violence, less instability if we were to relax borders. That's the whole thing the book is really about, questioning that, what I see as an assumption that has been made and never tested since 1945, that rigid borders secure and stabilize politics. We've never actually stopped to see if this is really true.
Yeah, I completely agree. You look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Cameroon, you look at the Tuareg in North Africa. Boy, there's a lot of instances where these people are all said they're part of one country and they just can't stop shooting each other. I mean, just because somebody said in 1930 you're all Iraqis didn't seem to solve all the Shia, Sunni, Kurdish identity. So obviously these people still have some sort of sense of themselves, regardless of if somebody said 80 years ago, you all fit here and you all fit here. We still keep seeing these conflicts. I keep coming back to the Tuareg in North Africa, who partnered with ISIS, and then there was, because of opportunism. And then I think there was another ethnic group in Sri Lanka that also partnered with ISIS. ISIS is going around finding these little ethnic groups that are marginalized and saying, oh, did the Western world not talk to you? Were you not admitted to the UN? I'll be your friend.
Long before ISIS appeared on the scene, the secessionists in northern Sri Lanka were notorious for their violence, illiberalism, and general awful behavior. They gave their own movement a very bad name internationally. But of course, that's a separate question from whether there was a legitimate concern among people in the north who, in many cases, supported this group, against the Sinhalese majority and some of its policies, which were classic examples of conflicts inside a state. Right, the movement there first began in response to attempts to impose more unitary language standards on what is a highly linguistically diverse environment. So a classic case of competition between communities. And the fact that the one in its extremity adopted very violent and unacceptable means is regrettable, should be condemned, but is not something that should lead us to a conclusion about whether or not such movements ought to be supported if they can maintain peaceable means. And of course, as we know, many people now know, bad as the northern Tamil Tigers were, their final crushing was a truly horrible event as well. It's not as if the South was not, as if the state was not itself engaged in terrible depredations. And this is an important point, that these are not conflicts that we should assign only to secession. Something I actually argue quite strongly in the book. There's no doubt there's a correlation between secession and violence. That's the thing we can accept. So many of the assumptions that we make about secession are actually quite wrong, I argue in the book, but that's when we have to acknowledge that there's a relationship. But that doesn't tell us what to think about it, because the real correlation, I think, is between secession and between violence and resistance to secession. Because in those few places where the secession movement is not opposed, we don't find violence. So it's not a simple equation that secession equals violence. It's secession when the alternatives to do this peaceably have been extinguished or are unavailable in the first place. That's a much more common problem, I think. So we should really consider carefully how we understand sort of normatively our relationship to this problem of secession and violence if it's being driven by the actors, the states that resist secession. And there was no violence in Scotland when they had a vote, right? And so no one there had to take up arms to vindicate themselves either. We'll never know what would have happened in northern Sri Lanka if the government had engaged in a process of negotiation.
Right.
But that means we can't just point to the violence and say, you see, secession is dangerous. We have to point to the state as well and ask what its behavior is.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, that is all my questions.
Right.
Please tell people how they can find your book and how they could get a hold of you if you'd like to chat more.
Sure. So for me, I teach at Indiana University, and my email is tiwaters@indiana.edu. Perhaps you can put it up in there at the end or something like that. The book, it's called Boxing Pandora. It's available from Yale University Press. So if you just go to Yale University Press's website, you can find it there. Type in Boxing Pandora Yale, and it'll show up. I think it's on Amazon as well. So it's available wherever books are available. And I hope people have a chance to take a look at it. And I've enjoyed the conversation, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to post this up and I'll get it to you today.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
You said you sometimes edit the sections?
Sometimes, but usually I try to. Well, let me stop the recording here real quick.
Oh, okay. Yes. You can cut this part off if you want.